Hello and welcome. Whether you're settling into bed with soft, sleepy breaths or taking a quiet pause in the middle of your day, this gentle journey invites you to drift back into the world of the Middle Ages. Make yourself comfortable. Allow your shoulders to relax, your thoughts to grow slower, and the noise of the present to fade into the background. Together, we'll step into the everyday lives of people often forgotten in grand tales of kings and knights. The peasants who worked the land, faced the seasons, and survived through both abundance and hardship. This is What Did Peasants Eat? Surviving famines and poor harvests in the Middle Ages. A calm, reflective exploration of resilience, resourcefulness, and the simple meals that sustained generations. Take a slow, deep breath. As you exhale, imagine the soft glow of dawn settling across rolling fields still wrapped in morning mist. Picture small cottages with thatched roofs, their chimneys releasing thin wisps of smoke into the cool air. In this peaceful retelling, we step away from the fear of famine and instead focus on the quiet determination that shaped each day. The way families stretched humble ingredients, the careful rituals of gathering and preserving food, and the deep connection people had with the land that fed them. Now imagine yourself standing beside a medieval village at first light. The air carries the scent of damp earth, fresh grass, and simple hearth fires springing to life. You might hear the gentle clatter of wooden bowls, the murmur of neighbors greeting one another, or the rustle of grain sacks being checked after a long winter. You may be lying comfortably in your home now, but a part of you can almost feel the uneven soil beneath your feet and sense the slow rhythm of a community waking to another day shaped by the seasons. Let your worries drift away like smoke curling toward a pale morning sky. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how peasants endured times of scarcity, how they turned coarse grains into hearty breads, how they gathered wild herbs and berries when harvests failed, and how they found comfort in broths, porridges, and whatever the land could spare. We'll sit by the hearth as simple meals simmer, wander through quiet fields dotted with rye and barley, and learn how ingenuity helped families survive when nature offered little. Through it all, we'll move slowly, letting each detail unfold gently, like the turning of an old, time-worn page. Now that you are calm and relaxed, let's begin this serene journey into the culinary world of medieval peasants. Our first chapter begins with the land itself, the soil, the crops, and the unpredictable harvests that shaped every meal. Settle in, breathe deeply, and allow this quiet exploration of history to carry you onward. And if you enjoy this peaceful journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can join many more calming adventures through the past. Chapter 1. The Medieval Landscape. A Quiet Beginning. The sun dips below the horizon, casting a soft golden hue over the sprawling fields of a medieval village. The soft glow of twilight bathes the landscape, and the wind, gentle and persistent, whispers through the tall grasses and rustling leaves of the surrounding trees. The world seems to slow down, the rhythm of life fading into a hushed quiet as the earth prepares for the evening's cool embrace. Each day in the medieval countryside unfolds with a kind of timeless simplicity, shaped by the turning of the seasons and the ever-present connection between man and land. In the distance, the faint sound of bells tolls through the village, signaling the approach of evening. It is the hour when farmers return from the fields, their hands calloused from a day of labor, and their hearts weary but content from the work of sustaining life. The cottages, scattered like pearls across the land, stand as simple refuges from the demands of the outside world. The stone walls, thick and cool, are the only protection against the harsh elements, and the hearths glow with the warmth of a simmering pot of pottage. In the air, the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil mingles with the comforting fragrance of wood smoke and drying herbs. Despite the apparent tranquility of the scene, beneath the surface there is a constant tension. The medieval world is fragile. The land, though generous at times, can be unforgiving. For the peasants who live off its bounty, survival is never guaranteed. It is a quiet struggle that defines their existence, one where every day is shaped by the unpredictability of nature. In this world, nothing is certain, and even the smallest misstep can lead to catastrophe. The medieval landscape is both their sustenance and their challenge. The soil beneath their feet is rich, yet subject to the whims of the weather. Long, harsh winters, unpredictable summers, and sudden storms that could wipe out entire crops. The land is their ally, but also their adversary. The farmers rely on their intimate knowledge of the seasons, their understanding of the rhythms of the earth, and their ability to adapt. Yet, even with their skill, the possibility of a failed harvest looms ever present. The seasons in the medieval world are both the backdrop and the driving force of daily life. Spring brings the promise of renewal as the first seeds are planted and the earth awakens from its winter slumber. The soil is soft and welcoming, the air alive with the fragrance of blooming flowers and fresh-cut grass. It is the time when farmers prepare for the coming year's harvest, planting the grains and vegetables that will provide sustenance for the long months ahead. Yet, even in this season of growth, there is uncertainty. The threat of frost, of sudden storms, or of drought hangs in the air like a shadow, a reminder that nothing is certain in this world. Summer is a season of vigilance. The crops grow tall in the fields, their green heads heavy with promise. But summer is also the season of heat and drought, and for the peasants, it is a time of constant labor. The days are long, the sun unrelenting, and the work in the fields stretches into every hour of daylight. The soil, once soft and yielding, now becomes hard and cracked under the harsh rays of the sun. The threat of famine looms large, for a poor harvest could mean hunger for the village. The peasants know that the success of the harvest hinges on the summer rains, those life-giving showers that will either nourish the crops or leave them to wither. The farmers toil under the scorching sun, never knowing whether their efforts will bear fruit or result in ruin. Autumn brings the harvest, the culmination of months of labor. It is a season of bounty, but also of exhaustion. The fields are ripe with the fruits of the earth, grains, vegetables, and fruits, ready to be harvested and stored away for the winter months. The peasants work tirelessly, gathering what they can before the first frost sets in. The air grows crisp, the sky deepening into a rich blue, and the days grow shorter. There is a sense of urgency in the harvest. Every moment counts. The fruits of their labor will determine the survival of the village through the cold months ahead. For the peasant, autumn is both a time of plenty and a reminder of how fragile that abundance is. The slightest delay, the smallest mistake, could lead to disaster. Winter is a time of rest for the land, but for the peasants it is a time of vigilance and hardship. The fields lie dormant under a blanket of snow, their fertility frozen in the earth. The wind howls through the barren trees, and the chill of the air bites at the skin. The peasants retreat indoors, huddling around the hearth for warmth and comfort. It is a time of scarcity, for the crops of the previous autumn are dwindling, and the stores of grain, meat, and vegetables are running low. The peasants rely on what they have preserved: salted meats, dried vegetables, and cured grains. They are frugal with their food, using it sparingly, for they know that the days until the spring thaw are many. The village may be quiet and still, but the fight for survival continues. The medieval world is one where life and death are determined by the seasons. The land provides the peasants with sustenance, but it also tests them, demanding resilience and resourcefulness. The farmers must be attuned to the rhythms of the earth, working in harmony with the land to ensure that there is enough food to carry them through the year. Yet even the most skilled farmer cannot control the weather, and even the most prepared village can be struck by disaster. The cycle of seasons, though predictable, is never guaranteed. A late frost, a summer drought, or a winter famine can turn the promise of abundance into a bitter struggle for survival. The relationship between the peasants and the land is one of dependence, but also one of resilience. The peasants have learned to live with the uncertainty of the world around them. They have learned to adapt, to make do with what they have, and to find strength in their community. In a world where survival is never assured, the bond between peasants is a vital lifeline. The village, though small and isolated, becomes a place of shared responsibility. Each peasant contributes to the survival of the whole, and in times of crisis, the strength of the community is what sees them through. The medieval village, with its thatched roofs and cobbled streets, is a place of quiet struggles and simple joys. The peasants wake each day to work the land, to till the soil, and to care for the animals that provide them with food. Their lives are shaped by the land, by the seasons, and by the rhythms of nature. Yet, even in the midst of hardship, there is beauty in the simplicity of their world. The slow, steady pulse of life, the quiet satisfaction of a meal shared with loved ones, and the deep connection to the earth are what sustain the peasants through the years. The medieval landscape is a place of contrasts, of abundance and scarcity, of work and rest, of life and death. For the peasants, it is a world of constant challenge and change. Yet, in the face of these trials, they endure. They have learned to survive, to adapt, and to find solace in the small moments of beauty and peace that the land provides. They are, in many ways, the heartbeat of the medieval world. For without their labor, the land would remain untended, and life itself would falter. Chapter 2. The Essentials of a Peasant's Diet. In the medieval world, food was the most essential part of life. For peasants, it was not just sustenance, it was survival. Every meal was a delicate balance of necessity and resourcefulness, drawn from the land, the seasons, and the meager resources they could gather or trade. While their wealthier counterparts dined on delicacies from foreign lands and exotic spices, the common peasant's diet was humble, often monotonous, and dictated by the whims of nature. Yet, despite these limitations, the food of the medieval peasant was surprisingly varied and nourishing, if simple. The foundation of the peasant's diet, more than anything else, was grains, and in particular, the grains that were easiest to grow in the varied climates of medieval Europe. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were the cornerstones of the peasant diet, grown in fields that stretched across the countryside, their fortunes tied directly to the land and the seasons. But while these grains were vital, it was their preparation, often labor-intensive and highly resourceful, that made them so essential. The importance of grains, particularly barley and rye, were the most accessible and affordable food for peasants who didn't have the means to grow more delicate crops or import goods. Wheat was often reserved for the wealthy, as it was more challenging to grow, and the demand for it was high in the urban areas. As a result, rye bread became the staple of peasant life. Though dark and heavy, rye bread was hearty, filling, and could stretch to feed many people. In times of abundance, peasants would bake loaves of rye bread to last through the colder months when fresh produce was scarce. Barley, on the other hand, was used primarily for ale and pottage, the warm, hearty, stew-like dish that was central to the peasant diet. Barley was easy to grow in a variety of climates and was often used as a grain in place of wheat for making bread, though it produced a much denser, thicker loaf. The versatility of barley made it invaluable, as it could be fermented to produce ale, a beverage much more than just a source of refreshment. It was, in many cases, safer to drink than water due to the fermentation process. The peasant's daily bread, whether rye, barley, or oats, was the ultimate comfort food. It was hearty and dense, filled with essential carbohydrates and a bit of protein. In many villages, bread wasn't just a meal. It was the meal, with every other food supplementing it. Bread could be eaten alone or used to soak up juices from stews or pottage, creating a complete meal that filled the stomach. For the peasants, bread was a constant presence at the table, an anchor in a world full of uncertainty. Pottage, the heart of the meal. If bread was the most frequent part of a peasant's meal, pottage was undoubtedly the heart of it. A rich, hearty stew. Pottage could be made from almost any available vegetable or grain, with occasional additions of meat or beans for added protein. The simplicity of pottage was its genius. Everything could be thrown together into one pot, making it a convenient, efficient meal that could feed an entire family or village. The ingredients might change depending on the season, but the idea remained the same. A warming, comforting dish that could stretch the smallest scraps into a filling meal. Pottage could start with a base of grains, barley or oats, simmered with water to create a thick, porridge-like consistency. Then, vegetables were added, typically root vegetables like turnips, leeks, and onions, which were often the only produce available in colder months. During the summer and fall, peasants would also add fresh greens like kale, cabbage, or peas, which could be grown in small gardens alongside the grains. Meat, while rare, might occasionally find its way into the pot, particularly during festivals or after a successful hunt. Salted pork, beef, or even poultry was added, giving the pottage a richer, heartier flavor. This humble stew was a symbol of both the resourcefulness and the resilience of the medieval peasant. It could be made from whatever was available, whether fresh or dried, and the flavors would change according to the season. It was not just food, it was life, sustaining the peasant family through the lean months, providing nourishment and comfort during the long, harsh winters. Dairy, a vital source of protein. While grains and vegetables made up the bulk of a peasant's diet, dairy products were an important supplement. Cows, goats, and sheep were kept for their milk, which could be turned into butter, cheese, or fresh milk. Unlike the wealthier classes, who enjoyed fresh, rich milk daily, the peasants usually consumed milk in more preserved forms. Cheese, in particular, was an essential foodstuff. It was easier to store and could last for months, sometimes even years, depending on how it was made and stored. Cheese was made from cow's milk, goat's milk, and even sheep's milk, with each type offering a different taste and texture. The process of turning milk into cheese was laborious but essential. The curds were separated from the whey, and the cheese was pressed into molds to shape and remove excess moisture. Cheese could be consumed fresh, but the most valuable forms were those that were aged, making it a food that could be stored and eaten when fresh food was scarce. For butter, the process was similarly straightforward. Milk was churned to separate the butter fat, creating the rich, creamy spread that could be added to bread or used in cooking. Butter was not only a source of nutrition, but also a luxury, particularly in winter months when other fats were in short supply. Peasants would often use butter for cooking or as a supplement to their meals, spreading it on their bread or adding it to their pottage for extra flavor. Meat, scarcity, and preservation. While the diet of the peasant was largely based on grains and vegetables, meat was a rare and valuable source of protein. The medieval peasant did not have regular access to the variety of meats enjoyed by the nobility. They often ate meat only on special occasions, or when the animals they kept were no longer useful for breeding, milking, or work. Pigs were the most common livestock raised for their meat, as they could be fed scraps and were relatively easy to care for. Pork, whether fresh or cured, was an essential protein source, and when pigs were slaughtered, every part of the animal was used. Hams, sausages, and bacon were common preserved forms of pork, and the fat was rendered into lard, which could be used for cooking or to preserve other foods. Poultry, like chickens, geese, and ducks, were also raised, though less commonly. In wealthier households, chickens provided eggs and meat, but for the peasants, eggs were a rare luxury. When poultry was consumed, it was often during festivals or special feasts. These birds could be roasted or stewed, providing a rich source of protein when available. Fish, while less common for inland peasants, was an important part of the diet in coastal or riverine communities. Fish could be eaten fresh or preserved by salting or smoking. In these regions, salmon, herring, and cod were some of the most commonly caught fish, and their preservation methods made them an important foodstuff during the lean months of winter. Preservation. The art of making food. Last, one of the most crucial skills for medieval peasants was preservation. The ability to make food last through the long winters and times of scarcity. Preserving food was not just a matter of convenience, it was a necessity for survival. Without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, peasants had to find ways to store their food in a way that would keep it edible for months on end. The most common methods of preservation included salting, smoking, and drying. Salted meats, such as bacon or ham, could be stored for months, providing a vital source of protein during the winter. Fish, too, was often salted or smoked to preserve it. Drying fruits, vegetables, and herbs was another common practice. Apples, pears, onions, and herbs could all be dried and stored for later use. These preserved foods were often added to pottage, soups, or stews when fresh produce was unavailable. Another form of preservation was pickling, which was used for vegetables and fruits. By immersing cucumbers, onions, or even cabbage in brine or vinegar, peasants could ensure that they had access to tangy, flavorful foods even in the dead of winter. Fermentation was also an essential method of preservation, particularly for dairy products like cheese and butter. Preservation was not just about ensuring that food lasted. It was about creating variety and ensuring that the peasants didn't have to live solely on the basic grains and vegetables available. It allowed for diversity in the diet and ensured that during the long winter months there would be enough to eat. Chapter 3: Surviving Famines, a Life of Scarcity. In the medieval world, even as the seasons turned with their promise of growth and harvest, there was always an undercurrent of uncertainty. The threat of famine hung over the peasant's life like a constant shadow. While nature's rhythms governed the land, they were capricious, at times yielding bountiful harvests, and at other times denying the earth's fertility. For the peasants, surviving famine was as much a part of their existence as the work they did in the fields, the food they ate, and the cycles of planting and harvesting. Their lives were defined by a constant struggle to make ends meet, to work with what they had, and to find ways to survive when resources were stretched thin. Famine in medieval Europe was not a rare occurrence. It was a recurring reality, one that shaped both the physical and psychological resilience of the common people. Whether due to a failed harvest, war, pestilence, or severe weather, famine could strike at any time, transforming the abundance of the harvest into a mirage and leaving villages on the brink of starvation. Understanding how peasants coped with these periods of scarcity requires a glimpse into the deep resilience and resourcefulness they relied on to survive. The unpredictability of the harvest. The foundation of medieval survival lay in the harvest, which was never guaranteed. While the earth seemed to offer its bounty, it could quickly be taken away by any number of factors. Bad weather, whether in the form of drought, frost, excessive rain, or hail, was the most common cause of crop failure. For peasants, the weather dictated everything. A dry summer might result in stunted crops, while an unexpected frost in spring or autumn could kill young plants. There was little that could be done to protect the crops from such forces, and the consequences of a poor harvest were immediate and devastating. Famine was not just the result of a single failed crop. It was often the outcome of several years of bad luck or poor weather patterns. A harsh winter could leave the ground frozen for months, delaying planting season. If the growing season was too short, the grains that were sown might not mature before the first frost. Even the most skilled farmer could do little to control these natural forces. And when a bad harvest occurred, it often led to a chain reaction of food scarcity that would last throughout the year. In these times, food supplies quickly dwindled. The stored grain from the previous harvest, often the only buffer between survival and starvation, would begin to run out. The more prosperous villages might still have a small stockpile of reserves, But for the poorer peasants, every bit of food was precious, and every grain of wheat or rye counted. The early part of the year was the hardest, as the winter months stretched on, and the spring harvest was still months away. For many, the time between harvests was a battle to stretch their limited food supply, and the fear of running out was constant. Foraging for survival. When famine struck, the peasants turned to every resource they could find to stave off hunger. One of the most important skills for surviving a bad harvest was foraging. Gathering wild plants, herbs, berries, nuts, and roots from the surrounding forests and fields. Foraging was not just a way to supplement the diet. It was a vital means of survival. The medieval forests, though often dangerous and dense, were rich with resources. Berries like strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries grew wild in the spring and summer months, providing a sweet and nutritious food source. Nuts, such as acorns and hazelnuts, were gathered in autumn and stored for the winter. Wild greens and herbs were also essential. Nettle, dandelion, and purslane were common, and peasants could find them in forests or along the edges of fields. These wild plants could be eaten fresh, or they could be dried and stored for later use. Many peasants were skilled at identifying edible plants, as this knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Root vegetables were another important source of food during times of scarcity. Turnips, carrots, and parsnips could be found growing wild in the earth, and though they were often considered poor food compared to grains or meats, they were filling and provided much-needed sustenance. Peasants also foraged for mushrooms, though this was a skill that required careful knowledge, as many wild mushrooms were toxic. Foraging was a skill that could make the difference between life and death during famines. When the stored grain and vegetables ran out, it was the wild food gathered from the forest that helped sustain the community. The forest, though a place of danger, became a lifeline for the starving villagers. Hunting and fishing. Scarcity and restrictions. For many peasants, hunting and fishing were sources of protein that could be relied upon during times of famine, though they were not without their challenges. Hunting was typically reserved for those who had the right to hunt or access to hunting grounds. In feudal society, hunting was often a privilege of the nobility, and peasants who were caught hunting on land they did not own could be severely punished. However, for those who did have access, hunting provided a vital source of meat during lean times. The most common animals hunted were deer, boar, rabbits, and birds, like pheasants and grouse. Hunting was not only a means of acquiring meat, but it also provided valuable skins and furs, which could be used for clothing or traded for other goods. However, hunting required skill, and even when successful, it could provide only limited quantities of meat. A single deer, for instance, might be enough to feed a family for a few days, but it would not last through an entire winter. Fishing, like hunting, was an activity that required access to the right resources. In regions near rivers, lakes, or the coast, peasants could fish for trout, salmon, herring, and eels. Fish was a valuable source of protein, and like meat, it could be preserved through smoking or salting. However, in inland villages without access to rivers or lakes, fish was a rarity. In these places, hunting small game or foraging for roots and berries was often the only alternative. When famine struck, the practice of hunting and fishing became even more critical. During these times, peasants might take risks to catch fish or hunt game, despite the risks of poaching. For the starving, the chance of catching a rabbit or fishing for a few pounds of fish was worth the risk of punishment. As the village ran low on food, there was little choice but to rely on every possible source of sustenance. The art of preservation. One of the most important skills during periods of famine was preserving food. Peasants who had the foresight to preserve their food during good harvests had a better chance of surviving the winter and periods of food scarcity. Preservation was not just about convenience, it was a necessity for survival. There were various methods of preserving food that were passed down from generation to generation, including salting, smoking, pickling, and drying. Salting was perhaps the most common form of preservation. Meats, particularly pork and fish, were salted to draw out moisture and prevent spoilage. The salted meat could then be stored for months, providing a source of protein when fresh food was scarce. Salted pork was often boiled to create a hearty stew, and salted fish was eaten with bread or mixed into pottage. In coastal regions, where salt was more readily available, salted fish became a staple during famine periods. Smoking was another popular method of preservation, especially for meats. Smoking not only helped preserve the meat, but also imparted a unique flavor that peasants came to appreciate. Bacon, ham, and sausages were often smoked to prolong their shelf life. Smoked meats could be kept for several months and were a vital source of nutrition during the winter months, when fresh food was unavailable. Pickling was used to preserve vegetables and fruits. Cabbage, cucumbers, and onions were commonly pickled in brine, allowing them to be stored for extended periods. These pickled vegetables became a common part of the peasant diet, providing both nourishment and variety during the long, cold months. Drying was another essential method of food preservation. Herbs, fruits, vegetables, and even meats could be dried and stored for the winter. Drying was particularly important in regions where freezing temperatures made other methods of preservation difficult. Fruits like apples and plums could be dried and used in cooking or eaten as snacks. Dried meat, like jerky, could be stored for months and was an essential protein source during famines. The role of community in survival. During periods of famine, the role of community became even more important. Peasants banded together, sharing what little food they had, and offering help to one another. Food was often shared among neighbors, with the strongest helping the weakest, and the most resourceful providing for the most vulnerable. This sense of community was a lifeline during times of scarcity, and it was the glue that held villages together during difficult times. In some cases, the church also played a role in providing aid during famine. The church, which was deeply intertwined with the social structure of the medieval world, often provided food and shelter to those in need. Monasteries and abbeys were places of refuge, where the poor could find not only food, but also work in exchange for sustenance. The church's role in famine relief was significant, as it helped to ensure the survival of those who might otherwise have perished. Chapter 4. The role of livestock. In the medieval world, the land was not the only provider of sustenance. While the soil yielded grains, vegetables, and fruits, the animals that roamed the fields and homesteads played an equally vital role in the lives of peasants. Livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens were not only sources of meat, but also crucial for labor, clothing, and even the economy of the medieval peasant. The relationship between man and beast was complex, symbiotic, and deeply intertwined with the cycles of life on the farm. To understand the role of livestock in the medieval world, it's essential to see them as not just animals, but partners in survival. Without livestock, the medieval peasant's life would have been vastly different. These animals provided food, work, companionship, and even a measure of wealth. For the peasants, raising and maintaining livestock was an art that demanded time, patience, and a deep understanding of animal husbandry. It was a skill passed down from generation to generation, one that ensured the survival of both the family and the community during lean times. The cow, the heart of the farm. Of all the animals kept by peasants, the cow was arguably the most important. Cows provided a variety of essential products: milk, meat, and hides. For the medieval peasant, the cow was a symbol of wealth and sustenance, a multi-purpose animal that played a pivotal role in the family's survival. The cow's ability to produce milk made it an irreplaceable source of nutrition, particularly in times of food scarcity. While the wealthier classes could afford to enjoy fresh milk, the peasants had to make do with a more practical approach. The milk produced by cows was often turned into cheese or butter, both of which could be preserved and used throughout the year. Fresh milk, while prized, was not always available, especially during the winter months when cows were less productive. Thus, the preservation of dairy products was vital. Cheese, in particular, was a valuable foodstuff. It could be stored for long periods, providing much-needed protein and fat when other food sources were scarce. The art of making cheese was passed down through generations, a skill as important as growing crops or maintaining the hearth. In addition to dairy products, cows provided meat when necessary. Though meat was a luxury for the peasants, a cow that was no longer productive in terms of milk could be slaughtered for its flesh. The meat of a cow, though tough and coarse, was highly prized, especially during festivals or times of famine. Every part of the animal was used, from the meat to the bones to the hide. Cow hides were turned into leather, which was used for making clothing, shoes, and bags. Even the bones could be used to make tools, handles, or for fertilizing the land. Cows were not just sources of food, however. They were also work animals. In many regions, oxen, castrated male cows, were used for plowing fields, pulling carts, and transporting goods. Oxen were crucial for agricultural work, particularly in the plowing and harrowing of fields before planting season. The oxen's strength made them invaluable for the labor-intensive work required to till the soil, transport heavy loads, and perform other essential tasks on the farm. The cow's role in the medieval peasant's life was multifaceted. It was a source of nutrition, labor, and clothing, and it often provided a measure of wealth for the family. A healthy cow was a valuable asset, and it was treated with care and respect. Families would go to great lengths to ensure the well-being of their cows, for their survival often depended on the milk and labor these animals provided. The sheep, wool, meat, and milk sheep, were another vital form of livestock for the medieval peasant. Like cows, sheep provided a variety of essential products: wool, meat, and milk. The wool of the sheep was perhaps the most valuable aspect of the animal, as it was used to make clothing, blankets, and other textiles. In a world without synthetic fibers or cotton, wool was one of the few natural resources available for clothing. The process of harvesting wool, or shearing, was a skill passed down through generations. Peasants would shear their sheep once a year, usually in the spring, when the wool was thick and soft. The wool was then spun into thread and woven into cloth by hand. This woolen cloth could be used to make clothing, blankets, and other necessities. In colder regions, woolen garments were particularly important, as they provided warmth during the long winters. Woolen socks, hats, and coats were essential items in the peasant wardrobe, and they were often passed down from one generation to the next. In addition to wool, sheep also provided meat. Though lamb and mutton were not as common as other meats, they were still an important source of protein, particularly in rural areas. Lamb was often eaten in the spring when it was fresh, while mutton, the meat of older sheep, was consumed during the winter months. Sheep could also provide milk, though it was not as commonly consumed as cow's milk. Sheep's milk was used to make cheese, which, like cow's milk cheese, could be stored for long periods. The sheep's role in medieval life was not just limited to providing food and textiles. Sheep were also used for fertilizing the land. Their droppings were an excellent natural fertilizer, and many peasants would allow their sheep to graze on fallow fields, enriching the soil with their waste. Sheep were also used for their leather, which could be turned into goods such as shoes, bags, and belts. The versatility of the sheep made it an indispensable part of the medieval farm. The pig, a source of meat and fat. The pig was another essential animal for the medieval peasant. Pigs provided meat, fat, and bones. Pigs were relatively easy to raise and were often allowed to roam freely, rooting for food in the fields or forests. This made them an ideal choice for peasants who had limited resources but needed a source of protein. A single pig could provide a family with months of food, especially if the meat was salted, smoked, or dried for preservation. Pork was a staple in the peasant diet, particularly in the winter months when other food sources were scarce. The meat of the pig was fatty and flavorful, and it could be cooked in a variety of ways. Bacon, sausages, and hams were common preparations, and the fat was rendered for use in cooking. Lard, which was made by melting down the fat of pigs, was an important cooking oil in the medieval kitchen. It was used for frying, baking, and even in the making of pastries. The pig also provided bones, which could be used for making tools, handles, and other useful items. Even the skin of the pig was put to use. It could be made into leather, which was used for clothing, shoes, and other goods. In some areas, the intestines were used to make sausage casings, and the blood was used in the preparation of certain dishes, such as black pudding. For the medieval peasant, the pig was a source of sustenance, fat, and labor. It was an animal that could be raised with minimal resources and cared for with relative ease. In times of abundance, a family might raise several pigs, ensuring that they would have enough food to last through the winter. When slaughtered, the entire pig would be utilized, with nothing wasted. This made the pig an invaluable part of the peasant's life. Goats and poultry, smaller livestock for every farm. While cows, sheep, and pigs were the primary livestock raised by peasants, goats, and poultry also played important roles. Goats were especially useful for their milk, which was often used to make cheese. Goat's milk was easier to digest than cow's milk, and it could be preserved in the form of cheese for later use. Goats were hardy animals, able to thrive in areas where other livestock might struggle. They were also efficient foragers, eating a wide variety of plants and shrubs that other animals might avoid. In addition to milk, goats provided meat, particularly in rural areas where the animals were raised primarily for food. The meat of a goat was leaner than that of other animals, but it was still a valuable source of protein. Goat hides were also used for making leather, and goat hair could be spun into yarn for making textiles. Poultry, such as chickens, geese, and ducks, were smaller but equally valuable sources of food. Eggs were a rare treat for peasants, providing them with a protein source that was often more affordable than meat. The meat of chickens, ducks, and geese was also consumed, though it was typically reserved for special occasions or times of abundance. Poultry was especially important in areas where space was limited, as they required less land and resources to raise compared to larger animals like cows or pigs. Chapter 5. Foraging for Survival. In the vast and often unpredictable world of the medieval countryside, the ability to forage was a crucial skill for survival. For peasants who lived close to the land, the knowledge of what nature could provide, whether it was wild fruits, herbs, mushrooms, or nuts, was not just useful, it was often essential. The practice of foraging connected peasants to the land in a way that went beyond simply cultivating crops. It was a skill passed down from generation to generation, as indispensable as the tools used for farming or the recipes used to prepare meals. Foraging was not limited to periods of famine or scarcity. It was a practice woven into the fabric of daily life, a means of supplementing the peasant's diet with fresh, wild foods that were gathered from forests, meadows, and fields. Even when the harvest was good, peasants would still venture into the wild to gather seasonal plants, fruits, and nuts. In lean times, however, foraging became a lifeline, often the only thing standing between the peasants and starvation. When the crops failed, the wild food that could be gathered from the land could make the difference between survival and death. The forest as a source of life. In medieval Europe, forests were both a source of livelihood and a place of mystery. They were seen as wild, untamed spaces, full of danger, but also full of resources. The woods were not simply areas for hunting and shelter. They were places where peasants could gather food that was beyond the reach of the farm. In the spring and summer, forests and woodlands offered a bounty of edible plants, berries, nuts, mushrooms, and herbs. In the winter months, when the fields were barren and the earth lay frozen, the forest still held its secrets. One of the most important foraged foods came in the form of berries. Wild berries, such as strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, and elderberries, grew in abundance in the wild and were eagerly sought after by peasants. These fruits could be eaten fresh, dried for use in the winter months, or turned into preserves or jams. Berries were not just a source of nourishment. They were also a luxury, a sweet treat to brighten the otherwise monotonous diet of the peasant. During the autumn months, the woods offered a wealth of nuts. Hazelnuts, acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts were common in many parts of Europe, and they provided a vital source of energy and nutrition. These nuts were gathered and stored for the winter months, when fresh food was scarce. Nuts could be eaten raw, roasted, or ground into flour to make bread or porridge. Acorns, though not a staple food, were particularly important during times of famine, as they could be ground into flour and used as a substitute for more conventional grains. Acorn flour, however, required careful preparation, as raw acorns are bitter and contain tannins that must be leached out before consumption. Mushrooms were another valuable foraged food. Though some mushrooms were poisonous, many were edible and highly prized for their flavor and nutritional value. Mushrooms such as chanterelles, morels, and boletes could be found in forests and meadows, and they were a coveted addition to the peasant's diet. They could be gathered and dried, then added to pottage or stews for flavor and richness. Wild mushrooms, when carefully selected, provided both sustenance and a touch of luxury to the humble meals of the peasantry. Herbs, too, were harvested from the wild, and foraging for medicinal plants was a practice deeply rooted in medieval life. Peasants were familiar with the medicinal properties of wild plants and herbs, and they used them to treat a variety of ailments. Nettle, dandelion, chamomile, yarrow, and mint were just a few examples of the plants that peasants might gather from the land. These herbs were used for teas, poultices, and infusions, and they could be combined with other wild ingredients to make remedies for ailments such as colds, fevers, or digestive issues. The knowledge of these plants was passed down through generations, and the ability to forage for medicinal herbs was an invaluable skill during times when access to formal medical treatment was limited. Foraging for roots and tubers. In addition to berries, nuts, and herbs, the earth itself offered a hidden treasure trove of roots and tubers. These underground plants were often overlooked, but were crucial during times when other food sources were scarce. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and rutabagas were some of the most common root vegetables that peasants foraged for, particularly in the colder months. Root vegetables were hardy, resilient, and could often be found even when the land was covered in frost or snow. They were a filling and nutritious food that could be used in stews, soups, or pottages, or eaten on their own as a side dish. The wild potato, which would later become a staple food in Europe, was not yet widespread in the medieval period. However, some regions, particularly in the more temperate areas, were already growing early varieties of the plant. The wild potato-like groundnut, a tuber found in many areas, provided another valuable source of food. Groundnuts could be dug up and eaten boiled or roasted, and they were known for their nutty flavor and high energy content. During times of famine, the peasants' reliance on these wild plants was crucial. When the crops failed, the ability to dig for roots and tubers could be the difference between hunger and survival. These plants were easy to find, easy to prepare, and packed with the nutrients needed to sustain life when other sources of food were no longer available. The seasonal cycle of foraging. Foraging was not a year-round activity. It was deeply connected to the changing seasons. The foods available to peasants varied greatly depending on the time of year, and foraging was a seasonal pursuit that required careful attention to the cycles of nature. In spring, as the earth thawed and new, growth began to sprout. The first foraged foods became available. Wild greens like dandelions, nettles, and purslane emerged from the soil, offering the first fresh nourishment after the long winter months. Herbs began to grow, and peasants would gather them for medicinal use, or to add flavor to their pottage. The wild strawberries began to ripen, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of the forest's bounty. This was a time of renewal, a time when the earth offered its first fruits to the hungry. Summer was the peak of the foraging season. The forests were lush with berries, and the air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit. Peasants would venture into the wilds to gather blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries, storing them in jars or drying them for the winter months. Mushrooms were abundant in the damp forest floors, and peasants who knew where to look could find a variety of edible fungi. The warmth of summer allowed for the gathering of nuts, including hazelnuts and acorns, which would be stored away for the colder months. Autumn was the time for nuts, mushrooms, and the last of the summer herbs. It was a time of preparation, when the bounty of the wild was preserved for the coming winter. Wild apples and pears could be found in orchards or on trees in the forest, their sweetness a welcome treat before the frost set in. Chestnuts, which ripened in the late autumn, were gathered by the bushel and stored for later use. The peasant's larder would soon be filled with dried herbs, preserved mushrooms, and jars of wild fruits. Foraging in autumn was not just about food, it was about ensuring survival through the harsh winter months. In winter, the land appeared to be barren, but even then, nature had its gifts. Root vegetables could still be found in the ground, especially if the winter had not been too harsh. Dried herbs from the summer were used to make teas and remedies for ailments. And though there were fewer foraged foods available, the knowledge of the land's gifts allowed peasants to find sustenance even in the darkest, coldest months. The role of foraging in the medieval economy. Foraging was not only essential for the survival of peasants, but also had a broader impact on the medieval economy. In many villages, foraged goods were traded at local markets, where peasants could exchange wild herbs, mushrooms, berries, and nuts for other goods or services. Foraging provided peasants with a measure of economic independence. While they were reliant on the land for their basic survival, their ability to gather wild foods allowed them to trade with others and acquire the things they could not grow themselves. In some cases, foraging was organized into a more formal system, with communities working together to gather resources from the wild. Villages might establish common lands or forests, where peasants could gather food in exchange for labor or tribute. The practice of foraging also helped maintain biodiversity. By gathering plants and seeds from the wild, peasants ensured the continued growth of certain species, maintaining a delicate balance between cultivation and natural growth. Chapter 6: Preserving Food for Lean Times. In the medieval world, survival was not just about the present moment. It was about preparing for the future. The peasants, whose lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, knew that the bounty of the harvest could not be relied upon to last through the long winter months. The key to enduring through lean times, when food was scarce, was preservation. Preservation was not just a matter of convenience or luxury, it was a necessity for survival. Without the ability to store food effectively, entire communities would have faced starvation. The art of preserving food was one of the most important skills passed down from generation to generation, shaping not only the daily lives of peasants, but their long-term survival. Preserving food was a way to make the most of what was available. It was about stretching the harvest, using every part of the plant or animal, and ensuring that there would be enough to eat during the difficult months ahead. The ability to preserve food required careful planning, knowledge of techniques, and a deep understanding of how food deteriorated over time. For the peasants, preservation was a form of security, a safety net that allowed them to face the harsh winters or any misfortune that befell the harvest. Drying. A time-honored tradition. One of the most widespread and simplest methods of preserving food was drying. The act of drying food was an ancient practice, and it was central to the medieval diet. By removing moisture from fruits, vegetables, herbs, and even meat, drying extended the shelf life of food, preventing it from spoiling and enabling it to be stored for months or even years. The drying process was especially important for fruits. Apples, pears, and plums were dried to preserve them for the long, cold months when fresh produce was scarce. These dried fruits could be eaten as snacks or rehydrated to be added to pottage or stews. The sweetness of dried fruit also served as a welcome treat during the winter months when fresh foods were limited. Berries, such as blackberries, strawberries, and raspberries, were also dried and preserved in large quantities. Berries were often used to make preserves or jam, which, while more time-consuming, offered a deliciously sweet addition to the otherwise bland winter meals. In addition to fruits, herbs were also dried for later use. Common herbs like mint, sage, rosemary, thyme, and chamomile could be gathered in the summer and dried in bundles. These dried herbs would be stored in jars or hung in kitchens, where they could be used in cooking or as medicines throughout the year. Dried herbs were particularly useful during the winter months when fresh herbs were not available. Vegetables such as peas, beans, onions, garlic, and tomatoes were also dried. These dried vegetables could be added to soups, stews, and pottage, adding flavor and nutrition during the lean months. The process of drying vegetables often involved cutting them into thin slices and placing them in the sun to dry. In more northern regions, where the sun was not as intense, peasants would use smokehouses or drying racks to preserve their produce. The drying of meat was another vital practice. In the medieval world, fresh meat was a luxury, and it was not always available, especially during the winter months. To preserve meat for later use, peasants would often smoke or salt it. Smoking not only preserved meat, but also added a distinctive flavor that was appreciated by the peasants. Bacon, ham, and sausage were common forms of smoked or dried meat that could be kept for months, providing a crucial source of protein when other foods were scarce. Fish was similarly preserved by drying, often in the form of salted cod or herring, which could last for months or even years if stored correctly. Salting. The art of preservation. Salting was one of the most reliable and widely practiced methods of food preservation. Salt, being one of the few natural preservatives available in the medieval world, played a central role in ensuring that food could last through the winter. Salt draws moisture out of food, which inhibits the growth of bacteria and other microbes that cause spoilage. The use of salt in preserving meat, fish, and even vegetables was crucial for survival. The most common foods that were salted included meat and fish. Pigs, in particular, were often slaughtered in the autumn, and their meat was salted to preserve it for the winter months. Bacon, ham, and sausages were all made by salting and curing the meat. The meat was rubbed with salt and sometimes other spices and herbs, then hung in cool, dry places to cure. This process could take several weeks or even months, but it ensured that the meat would be available when fresh food was not. Bacon and ham were considered vital sources of protein during the winter, and salted meats were often incorporated into stews or pottages. Fish was also salted for preservation. In coastal areas, fish like herring and cod were caught in abundance and preserved by salting. The fish were first gutted, then packed in layers of salt to draw out moisture. Salted fish could last for months, providing an important source of food for peasants living by the sea or along rivers. In inland villages, where fish was less common, salt was used to preserve the occasional catch. Vegetables could also be preserved using salt. Cabbage, for instance, was often turned into sauerkraut by fermenting it in salt. This method not only preserved the cabbage for months, but also increased its nutritional value. Salt was an essential component of preserving foods for long-term storage, and without it, medieval peasants would have been far less equipped to survive the harsh winters. Smoking, adding flavor and longevity. While salting was the most common method of preserving meat and fish, smoking played an equally important role. Smoking involved hanging meat or fish over an open fire or in a smokehouse, allowing the smoke to permeate the food and preserve it. The process of smoking not only helped preserve the food, but also added a distinctive flavor, which became a signature taste in many medieval dishes. Meat and fish were the most common foods to be smoked, though some peasants would also smoke vegetables. Bacon, ham, sausages, and jerky were common forms of smoked meat, while herring, cod, and other fish could be preserved in the same way. The smoking process could take days, depending on the size of the pieces and the method used. The food was often smoked in a dedicated smokehouse, where it was hung from hooks and left to slowly dry out, absorbing the smoky flavor and becoming a long-lasting food source. Smoked food could be eaten as it was, or it could be added to other dishes to impart flavor. The smoked bacon and ham found their way into soups and pottages, while smoked fish was often consumed with bread or made into stews. Smoking was a method that extended the shelf life of food while also making it more flavorful. It was an art that required skill and patience, but for the medieval peasant, it was one of the most important methods of preserving meat and fish. Pickling, preserving the harvest. Pickling was another method of food preservation that was widely practiced by peasants. Pickling involved immersing vegetables, fruits, or even meat in brine or vinegar to preserve them. The acid in vinegar or the salt in brine prevented the growth of bacteria and kept the food from spoiling. Pickled foods were a staple in many medieval households, particularly in the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Cabbage, cucumbers, onions, and beets were commonly pickled, as were eggs and meat. Pickled cucumbers and onions could be served alongside meals to add flavor and variety. Pickled beets and cabbage were also common, and they provided much-needed vitamins and nutrients during the winter months when fresh vegetables were not available. Pickled eggs were a popular snack, providing protein when other sources of meat were scarce. The process of pickling was relatively simple. Vegetables were washed, peeled, and cut into manageable pieces, then placed in jars or barrels. A brine or vinegar solution was poured over the vegetables, and the jars were sealed tightly. The pickled vegetables would then be stored in a cool, dark place where they could be kept for months. The acid or salt would preserve the vegetables, allowing them to retain their nutrients and flavor long after the growing season had ended. Fermentation. Nature's preserver. Fermentation was a method of preservation that relied on natural bacteria to preserve food. Fermented foods were rich in beneficial probiotics, which helped with digestion and health. While many fermented foods were not as commonly consumed by peasants as salted or dried foods, they still played an important role in preserving food, particularly dairy products and vegetables. One of the most common fermented foods in the medieval world was cheese. The process of turning milk into cheese involved introducing bacteria or fungi to the milk to ferment it, transforming it into a solid form. Cheese could be preserved for long periods by aging it, which allowed it to be stored for months or even years. Cottage cheese, cheddar, and soft cheeses were some of the varieties that peasants might make, often using the milk from their own cows, goats, or sheep. Fermentation was also used to preserve vegetables. Sauerkraut, made from fermented cabbage, was a popular food that could be stored for long periods. The fermentation process not only preserved the cabbage, but also added a tangy, sour flavor that made it a prized addition to the peasant's diet. Chapter 7. The Medieval Diet. What was consumed during famine? In a world where the rhythms of nature could turn from abundance to scarcity at the whim of the seasons, the diet of the medieval peasant was far from predictable. While the general diet of peasants might have been fairly consistent during times of plenty, famine, a word as familiar as the changing of the seasons, was a constant and looming threat. What happened to the food supply when harvests failed? How did peasants adapt when their grains failed to grow, or when weather turned unpredictable, disrupting the food cycle? Famine, as tragic as it was, shaped the medieval world and determined what was consumed during the most difficult times. When the crops failed, the communal reliance on food sources changed drastically. For the peasant, food wasn't just a daily convenience, it was a matter of survival. And during famine, every meal became a fight for endurance, resourcefulness, and creativity. What could be eaten when nothing seemed to grow, when the granaries stood bare, and the crops were lost to the weather's cruel hand? The role of grain during famine. In times of famine, grains like wheat, barley, and rye formed the backbone of the peasant diet. Yet, when bad weather struck, these essential crops became the most at risk. Drought, frost, excessive rain, or locust swarms could wipe out a harvest, leaving peasants without the food they relied on for survival. In these bleak moments, grain, particularly rye, became a commodity of survival, transformed into every conceivable food form to provide sustenance. When famine struck and grain supplies ran low, peasants often resorted to eating coarse bread, made from whatever grain was still available. This might mean rye bread in the absence of wheat, or bread made from a mixture of oats, barley, or even chestnut flour. The bread, already dense and often rough in texture, became even more difficult to digest in times of hardship. Rye, though hearty, was less nutritious than wheat, and its bread was more challenging to prepare. Yet in desperate times, the simple, dense loaf could stretch into multiple meals for an entire family. If the grain supply was exhausted, peasants would have no choice but to forage, looking for wild plants and roots to supplement what little they had. Roots like turnips and parsnips could be harvested from the fields, and even acorns might be ground into flour for bread. Acorn bread, though unpalatable and bitter, was sometimes consumed when no other options were available. Grinding acorns required leaching the bitter tannins out of the nuts, a time-consuming process that added to the difficulty of the already tough life. But it was, in the end, a source of calories, if not sustenance or pleasure. When all else failed, peasants often ground the remaining grains and mixed them with gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from whatever was left. In the worst of times, this gruel was the extent of the meal, just enough to keep one from succumbing to hunger. While gruel was easy to prepare, its taste was dull and its nutritional value limited. When famine set in, gruel might be the only food source available, fed to both the young and the old alike. It provided minimal calories, but in the absence of alternatives, it filled empty bellies, even if it could not nourish the body in the way a balanced meal could. Vegetables and roots, the wild food sources. When famine hit, the peasant had little choice but to turn to the land in search of wild food. The root vegetables that peasants had grown for their regular meals, turnips, parsnips, and onions, were valuable sources of food, but during famine, they became more essential than ever. These hardy roots, though simple and often overlooked, could provide a degree of nourishment when no other food was available. Turnips, with their large, thick roots, could be boiled, stewed, or even roasted over an open fire. In addition to the cultivated vegetables, peasants turned to the forests and fields for wild food. Dandelions, often considered a nuisance, were a common wild green that could be eaten in its entirety, leaves and roots alike. Nettle and purslane were other wild greens that, while bitter, could be boiled or stewed into a soup or pottage, helping to stretch the available food supply. These wild foods were not just a supplement to the diet. In times of scarcity, they were often the only thing between the peasants and starvation. Wild roots like burdock were also sought out. Burdock root, long valued in medieval Europe for its medicinal properties, could be boiled or roasted, providing some nutrients in times of scarcity. Similarly, acorns, which were often consumed only in the most desperate of circumstances, could be ground into flour after leaching out their bitter compounds. Acorn flour was used to make a bread-like substance that was dry and unpleasant, but filled the stomach when no other options remained. The wild bounty, however, was limited, and its supply could only go so far. During a severe famine, the land could not provide enough to feed entire communities. The peasants were dependent on their knowledge of the land and the seasons, foraging to supplement their meager stores. But these foraged foods could only carry them so far. The influence of meat. During famine, meat was considered a luxury for the medieval peasant under normal circumstances, but in times of famine, it was an even rarer commodity. Livestock, particularly cattle and pigs, were valuable for their milk, labor, and other resources, but slaughtering them for meat was often seen as a last resort. However, when food was in short supply, the necessity of protein from meat grew. Salted pork, bacon, and hams were typically preserved from earlier harvests, but these meats could quickly run out. When the livestock were slaughtered, their meat was either eaten fresh or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Poultry, chickens, geese, and ducks was likewise consumed when available, though often reserved for special occasions. During famine times, chickens might be slaughtered for their meat and eggs, but in the absence of fresh meat, their eggs became an even more precious commodity. The protein found in eggs could sustain a family when other sources of food were unavailable. In the worst of times, when even the animals were gone, peasants turned to the wild for meat. Small game such as rabbits, hares, and squirrels were hunted, though hunting rights were often reserved for the noble class. Despite these restrictions, peasants who knew the land could find ways to poach small game or catch fish from nearby rivers, lakes, and streams. However, hunting or fishing in times of famine was not without risk. Many peasants resorted to hunting without permission, which often led to punishment. The idea of poaching in times of starvation was sometimes met with leniency, but not always. Fish, though, was more readily available in coastal or riverine areas. Salted herring, salmon, and cod were preserved, and fish was often used to supplement meals when other sources of meat were unavailable. Though not ideal in every situation, salted fish became a more common food source in the absence of fresh meats, especially along the coasts or in regions near abundant fishing waters. The role of bread, the foundation of the famine diet. During times of famine, bread remained the foundation of the peasant's diet, even though its ingredients often became poorer and poorer with each passing year of poor harvests. The bread of a prosperous year, made from wheat or barley, became more and more sparse, and when grain stores ran low, peasants would bake bread made from rye, oats, or, in extreme cases, from acorn flour. Rye bread, dense and hearty, was a staple, particularly when wheat was not available. In times of famine, the quality of bread suffered, as the available flour was often coarser and less refined. Bread, in many ways, was the ultimate symbol of survival. Even when everything else was in short supply, bread could be made from the most basic ingredients. Bread could be eaten alone or used to soak up pottage or broth made from wild plants or the last of the preserved meats. It was versatile, filling, and calorie-dense, offering some semblance of comfort when nothing else could. In times of extreme hardship, bread might become even more basic. Gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from whatever grain or flour was available, might become the peasant's sole sustenance. While gruel was filling and offered some nourishment, it was bland and lacked the richness of more complete meals. It was a necessity in times of famine, a way to fill the stomach when nothing else was available, but it could not provide the same sense of satisfaction as a more varied meal. The role of the church in times of famine. During times of famine, the church played an important role in providing food to the poor. Many monasteries and religious institutions were involved in distributing food to those in need. In fact, the church was often one of the few institutions that had the resources to help communities during times of crisis. Religious orders maintained their own farms, which allowed them to feed the local population during times of scarcity. In addition to food, the church also provided spiritual support. Famine, after all, was a trial that challenged the very faith of a people who believed that their struggles were often part of divine providence. Church services might include prayers for bountiful harvests, while feasts and offerings were made in the hope of divine intervention. For peasants, the Church offered both practical and spiritual support, a guiding hand in times when they were unable to rely on the land or on their own resources. Rationing and sharing. The village's role. In the face of famine, the village as a collective played a critical role in ensuring that resources were distributed as fairly as possible. Peasants helped one another by pooling their remaining resources, sharing food, and working together to preserve what little they had. Community members often took turns foraging or hunting, distributing food among the most vulnerable members of the village, such as the elderly or the sick. Though hardship often bred competition for the last remnants of food, many villages adhered to a code of cooperation. During famine, sharing food was not just a matter of kindness, it was a matter of survival. A small act of generosity could make the difference between life and death for those most in need. Chapter 8. The Influence of Religion and the Church. Religion, in medieval Europe, was not just a matter of personal belief. It was a defining force in the everyday lives of the people. The Church was a central pillar in both spiritual and practical matters, influencing everything from social structures to food customs. For the peasant, the Church was far more than a place of worship. It was a lifeline, offering both spiritual guidance and practical support. When famine struck or the harvests failed, the Church was a place of refuge, offering solace and, often, sustenance. In many ways, the Church's influence shaped the diet and food customs of the time, from what was eaten to when and how it was consumed. Religion's deep integration with food and agriculture was driven by its connection to the cycles of nature. The seasons of planting and harvesting were sacred events, and the rituals surrounding them helped structure the rhythm of medieval life. The Church's role in regulating fasting, the blessings of crops, and the administration of food during times of scarcity underscored the extent to which religion influenced the medieval diet. The practice of fasting, the observance of holy days, and the patronage of local saints all had profound implications for what peasants ate and when they ate it. Fasting and its impact on the diet. One of the most prominent aspects of medieval Christianity that shaped food consumption was the practice of fasting. Fasting, as prescribed by the Church, had a profound impact on the peasant diet and food culture. The Catholic Church, with its vast influence over daily life, required fasting on specific days throughout the liturgical calendar. These fasting periods included Lent, Advent, Fridays, and Ember Days, times when eating meat, dairy, and certain other foods was prohibited. For the medieval peasant, fasting was not just a spiritual discipline, it was also a matter of survival. During times of scarcity, fasting could serve as a means of extending the remaining food stores. When the harvest had failed, fasting days could provide a break from depleting the already scarce resources of the village. However, it was also a time when hunger became more acute. Lent, which was observed for 40 days leading up to Easter, was particularly taxing for peasants, as it coincided with the harshest months of the year when food supplies from the previous harvest were running low. The Church's rules regarding fasting were strict. On fasting days, peasants were prohibited from eating meat, dairy, eggs, and fatty foods. This forced the peasants to rely more heavily on vegetables, grains, and fish, which were considered more acceptable for consumption during these times. Pottage, the thick vegetable and grain-based stew became the staple meal on fasting days, as it could be made from a variety of ingredients and was filling despite the restrictions. Fish, particularly salted fish, was allowed during these fasts and became a regular part of the peasant diet. Though peasants had limited access to fresh fish, herring, cod, and sardines were often preserved by salting, making them available during fasting times. Despite the church's dietary restrictions, fasting also had a spiritual and communal purpose. It was a time for reflection and penance, a time to focus on the soul rather than the body's material needs. Fasting served to reinforce the medieval peasants' dependence on divine providence. The belief that spiritual purification could lead to a bountiful harvest created a sense of connection between the church's rites and the peasants' agricultural efforts. The fasting and prayer practices were seen as ways to influence the success of the harvest and, thus, the availability of food. It was common for peasants to fast and pray for a good harvest, believing that doing so would increase the chances of divine favor, the church, and the blessing of the harvest. The church also played an important role in the blessing of the harvest. In many communities, the success of the crop was not just attributed to the hard work of the peasants. It was believed that divine intervention played a key role in ensuring the abundance or failure of the harvest. The church would often conduct harvest festivals with special services to bless the crops and pray for a fruitful season. During these events, peasants would bring offerings from their harvests, first fruits, grains, and vegetables, to be blessed by the clergy. This ritual was seen as a way to ensure divine favor for the coming season. The church's involvement in the harvest also extended to the regulation of the farming calendar. Specific feast days, such as St. Martin's Day, November 11th, were associated with key agricultural milestones, such as the beginning of winter plowing or the slaughtering of livestock. The church's involvement in these agricultural processes helped to guide the peasants' work on the land, providing a structure that tied religious observance to the practical needs of survival. The church's patron saints, such as Saint Isidore, the patron saint of farmers, were often invoked for blessings and guidance, reinforcing the idea that agriculture and faith were inextricably linked. When the harvest was bountiful, the church celebrated with feasts and special prayers of thanksgiving. These celebrations often involved communion with bread and wine, symbols of both spiritual and physical nourishment. However, when the harvest failed, or when famine loomed on the horizon, the church's response was more somber. The church would hold mass prayers for rain or special prayers to avert famine, hoping to sway divine favor toward the struggling villagers. In the most desperate times, the church might even distribute food to the poor, using the tithes and donations from wealthier families to feed the starving. Feasts, holy days, and the ritual of food. The church's influence on the peasant diet extended beyond fasting to include the religious feasts and holy days that punctuated the calendar. These were days when food played a central role in the rituals of worship and the celebrations of saints. While peasants were expected to fast during certain times of the year, feast days provided an opportunity for abundance. Meals of meat, wine, and rich foods were shared among family and community, often in connection with religious ceremonies. The medieval church calendar was dotted with feast days to honor saints, significant events in the life of Christ, and key moments in the Christian liturgical year. For peasants, these feasts provided a welcome break from the monotony of their regular diet. On these holy days, meat, especially beef and lamb, was a common feature, as it was a food usually reserved for special occasions. The abundance of these feast days was a form of spiritual celebration. The food consumed during these feasts was seen not only as physical nourishment, but as a way to honor God and the saints. In addition to the religious holidays, there were also secular festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, such as the Harvest Festival or the end-of-year feasts. During these times, peasants would gather in their communities to celebrate the end of the harvest season, sharing their food and giving thanks for the crop. These festivals, while linked to the harvest, also had strong religious overtones. Prayers were offered, and the food shared during these feasts was considered a communal offering to God, who was seen as the ultimate provider. For the peasants, these moments of celebration and feasting were not only a break from the harshness of daily life, but also a reminder of their interdependence on the land, on each other, and on God. The feasts were times of joy, but they were also a way for peasants to mark time and to reflect on the relationship between the divine and the physical world. In many ways, the Church helped to structure the medieval peasants' relationship with food, not just as a means of survival, but as part of a greater spiritual journey. Charitable food distribution. During times of famine, food was not only shared within communities, but also distributed by the Church as an act of charity. The Church, with its wealth and resources derived from tithes and landholdings, played a pivotal role in feeding the poor, especially when famine or crop failure struck. Monasteries and abbeys, in particular, were often the first places where peasants could turn in times of crisis. These religious institutions had storehouses of grain, salted meat, and other preserved food, which they distributed to the needy. The Church's role in charitable food distribution was grounded in Christian doctrine. Almsgiving, the act of giving to the poor, was seen as a religious duty. It was believed that through charitable acts, both the giver and the receiver could experience spiritual growth. The Church was often the only institution that could effectively distribute food to the poor, particularly in rural areas where markets were scarce. In some cases, the Church would organize communal meals during times of famine, where peasants could gather in the church hall to eat. These meals served as both a practical solution to hunger and a spiritual event, reinforcing the idea that food was not only for the body, but also for the soul. In addition to food, the Church also distributed seeds for planting, helping peasants to recover after a failed harvest. This act of charity, rooted in the Church's belief in supporting the most vulnerable members of society, reinforced the idea of a community bound together through faith and food. Chapter 9. Community and Sharing. The Village Economy. The medieval village, with its tightly knit community of peasants, was a world where survival was not just the result of individual effort, but the product of communal solidarity. In an era where resources were often scarce and life was fraught with the uncertainty of crop failures, disease, and natural disasters, the peasants' strength lay in their ability to come together and help one another. The village economy was not built solely on individual labor, but on the understanding that each person's survival depended on the collective efforts of the entire community. In times of scarcity or hardship, the bonds of community and sharing became more than just social niceties. They became vital lifelines that kept the village intact. The idea of community extended to nearly every aspect of medieval life. Food, the most essential of all resources, was at the center of these communal efforts. Whether it was pooling resources for the winter months or sharing the bounty of a good harvest, the peasants understood that their survival was not guaranteed if they tried to go it alone. Instead, they looked out for one another, offering help when it was needed. Whether that help came in the form of shared food, labor, or emotional support. The village was not merely a place where people lived. It was a community where interdependence was the foundation of life. The role of the manor and lord. In many medieval villages, the manor system played a critical role in the organization of the economy. The manor was a self-sustaining estate that included the lord's manor house, the fields, forests, and villages that worked the land. The manor was both a social and economic hub, bringing together the peasants who lived and worked there and the lord who owned it. The lord was often a noble or a landowner who provided protection, justice, and sometimes resources for the villagers. But in return, the peasants were required to work the land, pay rents, and provide a portion of their produce to the lord. While the manor system was hierarchical, it also operated within the context of cooperation. The peasants working the lord's land were often bound to the manor by feudal obligations, which could be difficult or even oppressive. However, these obligations were also accompanied by certain protections. In exchange for working the land and paying rents, peasants were granted security, shelter, and a degree of stability. The manor was a place where peasants found their livelihoods, and the lord provided them with the land they needed to grow their food. Within the manor, there was a deep sense of shared responsibility. The lord, though often distant and detached from the daily lives of the peasants, relied on the labor and cooperation of his villagers. The peasants, for their part, relied on the lord's protection and the structure of the manor economy. When resources were scarce, the lord might forgive certain rents, offer food stores from the manor's supply, or help organize collective labor to ensure the survival of the community. While the lord was ultimately the authority in the manor, the survival of the estate depended on the cooperative efforts of everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant. Harvesting and the community feast. The harvest season was a time of intense labor, but it was also a time for communal celebration. The arrival of the harvest, particularly in the late summer and autumn months, brought an end to months of uncertainty. The harvest was a shared event for the entire village, and it involved not only the physical labor of gathering crops, but also the sharing of what was gathered. Peasants worked together to bring in the grain, fruits, and vegetables, and in some cases, entire families or villages would go out into the fields to help gather the harvest. Everyone had a part to play, whether it was harvesting the wheat, storing the grain, or preparing it for market. Once the harvest was complete, the villagers would often hold a feast to celebrate the success of their collective efforts. The feast was not just a chance to enjoy food. It was also an expression of gratitude for the bounty of the land and the hard work that had made it possible. In times of plenty, the feast would include a variety of foods: bread, meat, fruit, vegetables, cheese, and wine. The fruits of the harvest were consumed, and the community gathered to share in the joy of the moment. The feast was a communal event that not only marked the end of the harvest, but also reinforced the sense of shared responsibility and solidarity. For many medieval peasants, the community feast was one of the few opportunities for socializing outside of the everyday work routine. It was a time to come together, share stories, sing songs, and celebrate life. In the context of the village economy, the feast symbolized both the hard work of the harvest and the rewards of working together. Even in lean years, when food was scarce, the community would still find a way to hold some form of communal meal, sharing whatever was left to ensure that no one went without. The role of the church in providing for the poor. The church was another integral part of the medieval village economy. It was not just a place for worship, but also a central figure in the provision of charitable assistance. The church played a key role in feeding the poor, particularly during times of famine or crop failure. In many regions, monasteries, abbeys, and churches held storehouses of food, and these reserves were distributed to the poor during times of scarcity. The church's charitable actions were seen as an extension of its Christian duty. The church believed it was obligated to care for the poor and vulnerable, as well as to provide for those in need during times of crisis. When famine struck, peasants who could no longer rely on their own food stores would turn to the church for help. Tithes, which were a portion of the harvest paid to the church by peasants, were often collected and used to fund these charitable efforts. The church would distribute grain, bread, and sometimes meat to the most vulnerable members of the village, particularly to widows, orphans, and the elderly. This practice of almsgiving became a lifeline for the peasants, especially during difficult years when the harvest failed, or when the community was affected by disease or other misfortunes. In addition to offering food, the church also offered spiritual support. The church's role during famine extended beyond the physical provision of food. It was a place where peasants could find solace, guidance, and comfort. Special prayers for the harvest, for rain, or for relief from famine were held at the church. The community would gather in the church to pray for divine intervention, hoping that their collective efforts and faith would bring a change in their fortunes. The collective effort of survival. Shared labor. The medieval village economy was built not just on the exchange of food, but also on shared labor. The economy of the village depended heavily on collective action. Peasants worked together to plant, tend, and harvest the crops. Labor was often divided by season, with each member of the community contributing to the tasks that needed to be done. This communal effort was not only practical, but also formed the backbone of village life. In times of crisis, the village economy became even more communal. Work parties would form, where groups of villagers would come together to perform specific tasks. These groups might be organized for the collective labor of harvest, but they could also be organized for more pressing needs, such as repairing houses or barn roofs after a storm, or assisting an individual family in building a new home. In some cases, villagers would help each other by providing labor in exchange for food or other goods. The barter system was prevalent in these moments of need, and survival depended heavily on cooperation. The need for cooperation went beyond just sharing food or labor. It also extended to the sharing of knowledge and skills. More experienced members of the village, such as the blacksmith, the weaver, or the healer, were expected to pass down their skills to others. The sharing of knowledge ensured that the village could function efficiently, even when resources were limited. Rural economy and trade. While much of the medieval economy was subsistence-based, there was also a trade component in many villages. Markets were held in larger towns, and peasants from surrounding villages would bring their surplus goods, whether it was grains, meat, wool, or crafts, to sell or trade. Bartering was a common practice in the medieval economy, particularly in smaller, rural villages where money was often scarce. Instead of paying for goods with coins, peasants would exchange what they had: food, labor, or services. Trade between villages allowed peasants to acquire goods they could not produce themselves, such as metal tools, textiles, and luxury items like spices. This exchange of goods helped to ensure that even the poorest peasants could access necessary materials and occasionally indulge in non-essential items. For peasants, trade also meant access to diversity in their diet, particularly spices, herbs, and rare fruits, which were considered luxuries but were sometimes traded in small quantities at the market. Markets and fairs were important social events. They were opportunities for peasants to come together not just to trade goods, but to exchange news, catch up with friends, and socialize outside of the confines of their isolated village lives. The marketplace was a microcosm of the broader medieval economy, where relationships were built, food was traded, and communities were strengthened through the shared experience of commerce. Chapter 10. The Peasant's Resilience. The medieval world was a land of uncertainty. From the fickle nature of the weather to the dangers of war, disease, and famine, life for the peasant was defined by struggle and hardship. Yet, despite the constant challenges they faced, medieval peasants exhibited an incredible degree of resilience. They were resourceful, adaptable, and able to endure circumstances that might have broken others. Their ability to survive and even thrive in such an unforgiving world was not the result of luck alone. It was a product of ingenuity, community, and an unwavering connection to the land. The resilience of the peasant was, in many ways, the backbone of medieval society. The peasantry, often seen as the lowest and most powerless class in the medieval hierarchy, was also the class that kept the wheels of society turning. Their labor in the fields, their resourcefulness in times of need, and their steadfastness in the face of adversity formed the foundation of the medieval economy and way of life. This chapter explores the many ways in which medieval peasants displayed remarkable resilience, from their ability to withstand famine and pestilence to their determination to rebuild after disasters. Adaptation to the environment. Living with the land. The medieval peasant's connection to the land was not just a matter of survival. It was a symbiotic relationship. To survive, peasants had to learn how to read the signs of nature, adapt to the changing seasons, and respond to the unpredictable forces that governed the earth. From the planting of crops in the spring to the harvest in the fall, peasants worked tirelessly to manage the land and make the most of its resources. Their survival depended on their ability to adapt. often making do with whatever was available to them. In regions where agriculture was difficult, whether due to poor soil, erratic weather, or the harshness of the climate, peasants learned to adapt their practices. They knew which crops thrived in certain conditions and which were more likely to fail. In places with rocky or infertile soil, peasants might have grown root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, which required less fertile ground than grains. In more fertile regions, they could grow a greater variety of crops, including wheat, barley, and oats, though even these crops were subject to the whims of nature. Peasants also adapted their farming techniques to suit the land. In regions with heavy rainfall, they might have used drainage ditches to prevent flooding, or in areas with dry spells, they would have focused on crops that could withstand drought. Crop rotation, a system of alternating the types of crops grown on the same piece of land, was another method that helped prevent soil depletion and ensured a more sustainable harvest year after year. This adaptability was not limited to farming practices. Peasants were resourceful in how they used every part of the land. Woodlands provided timber for building homes, tools, and fences, while also offering a source of wild food like berries and mushrooms. Rivers and lakes offered opportunities for fishing, and even forests provided essential materials such as acorns for flour or pine resin for making tar and pitch. Every aspect of the environment was utilized to the fullest extent, often in ways that may seem primitive to modern eyes, but were highly effective in ensuring survival. Resourcefulness in times of famine. When harvests failed, or when the weather turned against them, peasants had no choice but to become extraordinarily resourceful. During times of famine, the peasants' ingenuity was put to the test. With crops failing and food stores running low, peasants had to make do with what little they had. They knew how to stretch their resources, how to make dried meat last longer, how to turn roots and herbs into edible meals, and how to forage for wild foods when nothing else was available. In times of famine, preserved food was often the only thing standing between the peasant and starvation. Salted pork, smoked fish, and dried grains were invaluable sources of food during these lean times. The art of preserving food, whether by salting, smoking, drying, or pickling, was an essential skill that peasants relied on to ensure their survival during periods of scarcity. When all else failed, the peasants' resourcefulness extended to foraging. The ability to gather wild herbs, berries, nuts, roots, and mushrooms was a skill that could make the difference between life and death. Even when the fields were barren and the food supply was exhausted, the forest still held life-giving resources. Nettle, dandelions, and wild garlic were just a few of the plants peasants could find in the wild. Though bitter or unpleasant, these wild foods were full of nutrients and could be used to stretch a meager meal. Hunting also became an essential survival strategy during times of famine. For those with access to hunting grounds, the ability to catch small game like rabbits, hares, or deer could provide a vital source of meat. While hunting was often regulated by local laws reserved for the nobility, it was sometimes seen as a last resort for peasants facing starvation. The ability to catch game or fish could make the difference between surviving a famine or perishing. This resourcefulness extended to using every part of the animals and plants that were available. The meat was consumed, of course, but so were the bones, skins, and intestines. Bones could be used to make tools or utensils, while hides could be turned into clothing or leather goods. Intestines were sometimes used to make sausages, and even blood could be cooked into dishes like black pudding, adding protein when other sources of meat were not available. Community support and mutual aid. One of the greatest sources of resilience in the medieval world was the ability of peasants to come together as a community. The peasants' survival did not rest solely on individual effort, but on the collective strength of the village. In a time of crisis, the bonds of the community became a vital lifeline. The communal nature of medieval villages meant that peasants relied on one another for mutual aid. When a famine struck, the village would often come together to share resources. The wealthier peasants might have had a little extra grain or meat, and these could be distributed to the more vulnerable members of the community. In return, the less fortunate peasants would offer their labor in exchange for food or other resources. Barter was a common form of exchange in the medieval economy, especially when cash was scarce. Labor exchanges, where one peasant worked for another in exchange for food, were frequent, particularly in the wake of bad harvests. In addition to labor exchanges, peasants also practiced cooperative farming. While each family had its own plot of land, the work of planting, harvesting, and tending to crops often required group effort. During busy seasons like the harvest, entire villages might work together to bring in the crops. This communal labor meant that even in hard times, no one was left to face the work alone. Every member of the village had a role to play, whether it was in the fields, the kitchen, or the barn. When disease or famine struck, it was not uncommon for the village to hold communal feasts. Even during the worst times, when food was scarce, the sense of community was strong enough to ensure that everyone received something to eat. These shared meals were not just about food, they were about solidarity. A communal feast could be the difference between survival and despair, as it offered both nourishment and a sense of connection in the face of hardship. Peasants also shared their knowledge and skills. The older generations passed down essential survival skills, such as foraging, preserving food, and working the land, to the younger ones. The collective knowledge of the village was what allowed them to endure. In times of famine, peasants who knew where to find wild food or how to preserve meat could make the difference in helping their community get through the hardest months. These shared practices ensured that, no matter the circumstances, the knowledge to survive was never lost. Psychological resilience, the strength of the human spirit. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the peasants' resilience was their psychological fortitude. Life in medieval Europe was brutal and unpredictable, but peasants developed an unshakable sense of survival. Faced with hardship, disease, and the ever-present threat of famine, the peasants found ways to endure through sheer willpower and hope. The medieval peasant was deeply connected to their land and the cycles of nature. This connection, though it often meant a life of uncertainty, also gave peasants a sense of purpose. They were intimately involved with the earth, working the land day in and day out, and finding meaning in their labor. The work they did was life-sustaining, not only for themselves, but for their communities. This connection to the earth and the natural world provided a sense of stability amidst the chaos. Moreover, The peasants' belief in the divine provided a psychological buffer against the hardships they faced. Faith in God, the saints, and the intercession of the church allowed peasants to endure difficult times with a sense of hope. They believed that through prayer and penance, divine intervention could bring an end to their suffering. Even when the land failed to yield its bounty, peasants would turn to the church for comfort, trusting that their faith would see them through. The psychological resilience of peasants was not just about endurance, it was about adaptation. The medieval peasant was never defeated by a single bad harvest or a failed season. Instead, they adapted to the circumstances, found new ways of feeding themselves, and survived, often with remarkable ingenuity. Their strength lay not just in the ability to endure, but in the ability to hope, to trust in their community, and to believe that tomorrow would bring a better future. Chapter 11. The medieval peasant's diet and its relationship with social hierarchy. The medieval period was a time of deeply entrenched social stratification, and food, more than just sustenance, was often a symbol of wealth, power, and status. While the peasant's diet was marked by simplicity and scarcity, the diets of the nobility and clergy reflected the wealth, privilege, and access to resources they enjoyed. In this rigidly hierarchical society, the food one consumed often signified one's social standing, and what the peasant ate and was able to eat was shaped by the broader social, political, and economic forces of medieval life. The relationship between food and social hierarchy was complex. While peasants worked the land and grew the food that sustained all levels of society, they often had limited access to the fruits of their labor. The rich foods of the noble classes, delicacies like roast meats, spices, sugars, and exotic fruits, were far beyond the reach of the peasant. The division between the diets of peasants and nobles was stark, illustrating the profound inequalities of the medieval world. Yet, even within the confines of their limited resources, peasants found ways to adapt and survive, creating a diet that, though humble, was rich in the resources available to them. This chapter explores how food was both a reflection of the medieval peasant's social position and a tool for navigating the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. By examining the different levels of society and the foods that sustained them, we gain insight into the social inequalities, cultural norms, and economic realities that shaped medieval life. The peasant's diet, simplicity, and scarcity. The diet of the medieval peasant was marked by simplicity and scarcity. The peasant's life was centered around the land, the soil they worked, the crops they grew, and the animals they raised. Unlike the nobility, who had access to a wide variety of foods, peasants were dependent on what they could produce themselves or trade within their community. Their diet was primarily based on grains, barley, rye, wheat, and oats, as well as vegetables, legumes, and some animal products such as milk and cheese. Bread was the most common and basic form of sustenance for the peasant. Rye bread was the staple in many regions, as rye was hardier than wheat and grew well in poor soil. Bread, in all its forms, was the foundation of every meal. It was often eaten with pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from grains, vegetables, and whatever meat or scraps were available. This was often the extent of the peasant's daily meals, hearty, filling, but simple. Meat, though valuable and essential, was eaten rarely due to its cost and scarcity. When meat was available, it was often pork, chicken, or fish, particularly in coastal areas. In times of scarcity, when the harvest failed or weather disrupted the food supply, the diet of peasants became even more austere. The grain harvest was a crucial determinant of peasant survival, and when crops failed, famine loomed large. During these times, peasants made do with roots and wild plants they could forage from forests and fields. They also relied on preserved food. Dried meats, salted fish, and pickled vegetables were a common means of surviving the winter months or times of food shortage. Without refrigeration or the modern means of preservation, food preservation was an art passed down through generations, and it played an essential role in ensuring survival during difficult times. The noble class, a diet of luxury and abundance. In stark contrast to the peasants, the noble class enjoyed a far more varied and luxurious diet. The food consumed by the nobility was symbolic of their wealth and status, reflecting their access to resources and their ability to obtain the finest ingredients available. The Lord's table was laden with rich meats, exotic spices, and sugary treats, items that were often out of reach for the peasant class. The nobility had access to a variety of foods that demonstrated their elevated position in society. The meat consumed by the nobility was far richer and more varied than that of the peasants. Beef, venison, wild boar, and mutton were common staples at noble feasts. The meats were often prepared in elaborate ways, seasoned with a variety of herbs and spices, luxuries that were beyond the reach of common folk. The use of spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger was a hallmark of noble cuisine, and these imported goods were considered a symbol of wealth and sophistication. Spices were not only used to enhance the flavor of dishes, but were also believed to have medicinal properties, further elevating their status. In addition to meats and spices, the noble diet was rich in sugary treats and fruits. Honey, a common sweetener, was used in desserts, and fruits such as apples, pears, plums, and cherries were often featured at feasts. The nobles had access to imported fruits such as oranges and dates, which were considered exotic and luxurious. The feast table would often include elaborate pastries, cakes, and tarts, foods made with butter, sugar, and flour. The use of sugar was especially notable as it was expensive and scarce in medieval Europe, reserved primarily for the upper classes. While the peasant ate simple and hearty meals to sustain their labor, the noble diet was designed for enjoyment and indulgence. Feasts were an important part of noble life, particularly during festivals and holidays. The nobles often entertained guests with elaborate banquets that could last for hours, with multiple courses of meat, fish, bread, and dessert. These feasts were not just about food. They were about displaying wealth and asserting status. The clergy, a diet in between. The clergy, the monks, friars, and other religious figures who lived in monasteries, convents, and churches, occupied a unique position in the medieval social hierarchy. The diet of the clergy was somewhere between that of the peasant and the noble, reflecting their religious duties and the austere lifestyle expected of them. While the clergy was expected to follow the principles of humility and self-denial, they also had access to resources that were not available to peasants. Monks and friars, for example, were provided with meals in the monastic refectory. Bread and beer, often brewed in the monasteries, were common staples of their diet. Fish, especially in coastal areas or along rivers, was often consumed in place of meat, especially on fasting days. The monastic diet was largely vegetarian, and meals were usually simple but filling, consisting of bread, pottage, and vegetables. However, unlike peasants, the clergy had access to better quality bread and fresh cheese, often produced within the monastery itself. Monastic orders had the ability to grow their own food and preserve it for the winter months. They had extensive gardens where vegetables were grown, and many monasteries even raised livestock. In times of famine or food shortages, the monasteries would open their doors to the poor and offer alms in the form of food. The hospitality of the church was an important part of its mission, and the clergy were seen as the caretakers of the poor, providing them with spiritual and material sustenance. Despite the relatively modest nature of the clergy's diet, they still had privileges that peasants did not. The clergy had access to wine, which was a significant part of religious rituals and served at the altar for Holy Communion. The consumption of wine by the clergy was often not just limited to spiritual reasons. It was part of their daily life, and it reflected their position in the social hierarchy. Diet and social status, a symbol of power and control. Food in the medieval world was not just a means of survival, it was a symbol of power and control. The ability to consume a wide variety of food, especially rare and exotic items, was a direct reflection of one's social status. For the peasant, the diet was restricted by both economic constraints and social expectations. The peasant had little control over the food they ate, and their diet was shaped by the limited resources available to them. On the other hand, the nobility had the privilege of choosing from a wide variety of foods, many of which were imported from other parts of the world. This stark contrast in food availability reflected the larger social divisions that defined medieval society. The power dynamics surrounding food were evident in the manorial system. The lord, as the owner of the land and the primary producer of food, controlled the distribution of resources. The peasants, who worked the land, were responsible for providing the lord with food and rent. In exchange, they were allowed to keep a portion of the harvest for themselves. However, in times of famine, the lords had the right to increase rents or seize food from the peasants, further exacerbating the inequality between them. The availability of food for the peasants was determined not only by the success of the harvest, but also by the whims of the ruling class. Food was also used as a means of control through feasts and bans. The nobility held elaborate feasts not just to celebrate abundance, but to assert dominance. By controlling the food supply and by hosting these lavish banquets, the nobility reinforced their power and privilege. The feasts were a form of social and political theater, where the guests, often other lords, knights, or clergy, were reminded of their subordinate status. The luxurious foods served at these feasts symbolized the divide between the nobility and the peasants, who were excluded from such indulgences. The economy of food, markets, barter, and trade. In the medieval world, food was not only a matter of survival, it was also a form of currency and an essential part of the market economy. While peasants might have little access to cash or coin, they could trade food in the form of barter. Grain, livestock, wool, and other foodstuffs were exchanged at local markets for other goods or services. For peasants, these markets provided an opportunity to sell their surplus food and acquire the things they could not produce themselves, such as tools, cloth, or luxury items. The act of trade, both in food and other goods, was essential for the survival of medieval communities. Villages would organize regular market days, where peasants could sell their produce and exchange it for items they needed. Larger towns had established trade routes, allowing for the exchange of food and resources on a broader scale. The economy was deeply tied to the movement of food, with grain merchants, butchers, and fishmongers playing crucial roles in ensuring that food reached the people who needed it. Conclusion: the legacy of the medieval peasant diet and resilience. The medieval world, often viewed through the lens of hardship and scarcity, paints a picture of human endurance against the forces of nature, social hierarchy, and economic instability. At the heart of this world was the peasant, whose diet was shaped by their connection to the land and their daily struggle for survival. The diet of the medieval peasant, simple yet essential, formed the foundation of not only their physical survival, but their cultural identity. It was in the food they grew, foraged, preserved, and shared that the resilience of the medieval peasant was truly reflected. This resilience wasn't merely a matter of surviving. It was about adapting, surviving, and thriving in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. Throughout this exploration, we've journeyed through the various aspects of the medieval peasant diet, from their relationship with the land and the seasons to their dependence on livestock, foraging, food preservation, and communal sharing. Each chapter painted a portrait of a world governed by uncertainty, where food was both a precious resource and a reflection of the social, political, and economic forces at play. Yet, within these confines, peasants exhibited remarkable resourcefulness, resilience, and community spirit, characteristics that were essential for their survival. Despite their limited means, the peasants of the medieval world found ways to navigate hardship and scarcity through innovation, cooperation, and a deep connection to the land. The central role of food in medieval life. Food was not simply a means of survival, it was central to medieval identity, reflecting the social structure, cultural values, and economic realities of the time. The medieval diet, particularly that of the peasant, was shaped by the land, the seasons, and the constraints of their socio-economic position. What peasants ate, how they obtained it, and how they preserved it reflected not only their own ingenuity, but also the larger structures of feudalism that governed their lives. At the core of medieval food culture was the dependence on agriculture. The seasonal rhythms of planting, cultivating, and harvesting formed the very essence of daily life for peasants. The connection between the land and the people who worked it was reciprocal. Peasants gave their labor to the land, and in return, they expected sustenance. However, as we have seen, this connection was fraught with uncertainty. A failed harvest, a harsh winter, or the unexpected shift in weather patterns could turn a season of plenty into a season of starvation. Yet, despite these challenges, peasants persevered, utilizing every scrap of knowledge, resource, and technique available to make the most of what they had. While the nobility and clergy enjoyed an abundant, varied diet, marked by fine meats, rich spices, and imported luxuries, peasants had little access to such extravagances. Their food was a humble reflection of their status and labor in society. bread, pottage, vegetables, and occasionally meat formed the backbone of their meals. Yet, even within these limitations, the medieval peasant found a way to make their food serve not just as sustenance, but as a vital part of their cultural fabric. The shared meals, communal labor, and the resilience in the face of food scarcity bound the medieval peasant community together. In a world defined by rigid class distinctions, food was one of the few areas where cooperation, solidarity, and shared survival were possible. Adaptation and innovation in the face of famine was an ever-present threat, casting a shadow over the medieval peasant's life. Bad harvests, disease, and poor weather could reduce a once bountiful harvest to a meager fraction of its potential, leaving peasants scrambling to survive. Yet, the peasant's ability to adapt and innovate in the face of adversity was unparalleled. When grain failed, peasants turned to wild foods, roots, and foraged materials to supplement their diets. When meat was scarce, peasants made use of preserved foods, dried meats, salted fish, and cured vegetables to endure the harsh winter months. Their resilience was not just about surviving the famine, it was about finding ways to live through it. One of the key aspects of peasant resilience was their relationship with food preservation. In a world without refrigeration, the ability to preserve food through methods like drying, salting, smoking, and pickling was essential. These techniques allowed peasants to store the fruits of their labor and ensure that they had access to food during the long, lean months when fresh produce was unavailable. This careful management of food resources, whether from the preservation of grains or the salting of meat, was a lifeline that ensured the survival of families and entire villages. Famine, however, was not just about a lack of food. It was also about a loss of hope and security. The peasant diet during times of scarcity was often reduced to gruel or bread, made from whatever grain or root was available. The meals, while sustaining, were bland and uninspiring. Yet, even in the face of such hardship, peasants demonstrated an extraordinary ability to persevere. They found meaning and comfort in sharing meals with others, in communal labor, and in the belief that a better harvest was just around the corner. This perseverance was not just about physical survival. It was about maintaining dignity and hope in the face of uncertainty. The role of community in ensuring survival. One of the central themes of the medieval peasant diet was the importance of community. In times of abundance, the peasant community could come together to celebrate the harvest with feasts and shared meals. But in times of scarcity or famine, it was the cooperation of the community that ensured survival. The medieval village was not just a group of individuals, it was a collective, a web of interdependence where survival was not the responsibility of any single person, but of everyone. Peasants worked together in the fields, shared food, and bartered to ensure that everyone had enough to survive. During times of famine, the village economy was built on mutual support. When the food supply ran low, the wealthier peasants might share their remaining stores with those in need, or the community would come together to forage or hunt for wild food. The act of sharing food during hard times was not just a practical necessity. It was a social contract that defined the communal nature of medieval life. In a world of uncertainty, the ability to come together as a village was what kept the community strong. The church, too, played a vital role in community support. As we discussed in earlier chapters, the church acted as a provider of alms and charitable food distribution, helping those in need during times of crisis. The tithes collected from the peasantry were used to stockpile food stores, which could then be distributed to the poor during times of famine or drought. The church also provided spiritual support, offering hope and guidance during the bleakest of times. The role of religion in shaping the peasant diet. Religion also played a central role in shaping the peasant diet, both in terms of the food they could consume and the practices they followed. Fasting, holy days, and rituals governed when and how peasants could eat certain foods. The church prescribed fasting days, during which peasants were forbidden from eating meat, dairy, and other indulgent foods. These fasts, especially during Lent and on Fridays, created periods where peasants had to rely on simpler foods such as vegetables, grains, and fish. But beyond the rules of fasting, the church also shaped the medieval diet through its blessings of the harvest. Feasts and holy days celebrated the abundance of the land and were often occasions for indulgence, with elaborate meals full of meat, spices, and sweet treats. These meals, though they were typically reserved for the elite, were also seen as rituals of thanksgiving for divine favor. Even the peasant community was involved in the sacred act of blessing the harvest, which reinforced the connection between food, faith, and survival. For the medieval peasant, religion was a framework that not only governed their food, but also shaped their worldview. They believed that their diet, the abundance or scarcity they experienced, and even the quality of their harvests were divinely influenced. Faith was as crucial to their survival as any physical sustenance. The spiritual nourishment they received from the church was just as important as the food they ate, and their resilience was in many ways fueled by the hope that divine intervention would ensure a good harvest. The enduring legacy of the peasant diet. The medieval peasant diet, while shaped by adversity, left an enduring legacy. Though their lives were often defined by hardship, their connection to the land, their ability to preserve food, and their reliance on community shaped a way of life that endured for centuries. The diet of the peasant may have been simple, but it was also practical and sustainable. It was a diet built on resourcefulness, resilience, and cooperation, values that were integral to the survival of medieval peasants. This way of life, though in many ways lost to modernity, offers lessons in how communities can come together in the face of uncertainty, how resourcefulness can provide sustenance in times of scarcity, and how the human spirit, when tested, can remain unbroken.